happy Monday to one and all. Welcome to Motivating Monday. I'm hoping that you've had a great weekend and are raring to go for this week ahead. This month, we will be embarking on a series entitled The Case For. In line with the fact that today is Labor Day, we will be addressing the case for labor. I did not know this until quite recently, but the history of Labor Day is rather interesting. It started with mass work stoppages or strikes by workers in support of an 8-hour workday. This movement was meant to regulate the length of a working day and preventing excesses and abuses of working hours, which were in practice prior to the 20th century. Today, Labor Day is one of the most internationally recognized secular holidays. Officially, it is known as International Workers' Day. Other names may include Labor Day or May Day. It is commemorated in various ways around the world. And for example, in Singapore, it is just, another public holiday, a day of rest rather, from our labors, for which I'm very thankful as it allows us to have the marriage retreat this week. In other countries, Labor Day is marked as an important holiday featuring parades and military displays. Drawing on this theme then, what is the case about labor for the Christian? We see that the word labor appears 89 times in the Bible and has been used in various ways. In the Old Testament, it has been used to refer to produce and toil. In Genesis 31 verse 42, when Jacob fled from Laban, his father-in-law, we see this word used in this sense. Likewise, it can also be used to describe or symbolize the process of giving birth. At the birth of Benjamin, for example, in Genesis 35 verse 16 to 17. It can also be used to express exhaustion and weariness. Job, in answering to his friends about his labors in Job chapter 9, verse 29, and Solomon speaking against wearing ourselves out for the riches of this life in Proverbs 23 and verse 4. In the New Testament, the word labor is used to denote toil, pains, or cut, especially when in Hebrews chapter 6 verse 10, when the Hebrew writer says, "For God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love." And the word labor there, is coming from the Greek word kopos, which means a cut or pains or toil. It can also be used in the sense of again fatigue or exhaustion, right? In 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 17, where the elders are to be counted for double honor, especially they who labor or are fatigued in the word and in the doctrine. Finally, it can be used to denote a trade or a work or to do business, right? And in John chapter 6 verse 27, right, which we will study here subsequently, labor not for the meat which perisheth. Now, what then should be the Christian's attitude towards labor and the case that God makes for our labors? Firstly, God knows our labors and works. For God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which you have showed towards his name, in that ye have ministered to the saints and do minister. Hebrews chapter 6 verse 10. In Revelations 2 verse 2 to 3, I know thy works and thy labor and thy patience, and how thou canst not bear them which are evil. And thou hast tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and hast found them liars. And thou hast borne and hast patience for my name's sake, hast labored and hast not fainted. You see, we serve and labor for a God that knows and recognizes the labor that we do for him. we do not serve a God that is oblivious or indifferent to our works. And him forgetting our works is likened to, rendering our Lord as unrighteous, right? For God is not unrighteous. And so, first, the Christian's attitude towards labor is one that turns to God, who recognizes, who acknowledges, who remembers our labor for him. Secondly, that labor is not to be primarily focused on this present life. Labor not for the meat which perishes, but for the meat which endures unto everlasting life. John chapter 6, verse 27. Which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. It's not that we cannot work for the temporary needs of this life. After all, we are to provide for the needs of our own, especially those of our own household. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. This implies some kind of laboring for us to get gain in order to finance these needs. Also, again, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 10, Paul writes to the Thessalonian church, if any would not work, neither should he eat. So it's not that we cannot work for the temporary needs of this life, but rather it speaks to the relative weight that we ought to place between the needs of this life, which perishes, compared with the meat which endures into everlasting life. We are encouraged in Hebrews 4 verse 10 to 11 to instead labor to enter into that rest and to be ceased from our works. And so the Christian's attitude, secondly, should be one that is eternally, or that has a view towards the eternal reward. And the third part of labor is that reward comes from the Lord. The reward of rest comes from our Lord. In Matthew 11, verse 28 to 29, he calls us to come to him, all who labor and are heavy laden, and he will give us rest. We are to take his yoke upon us and to learn of him, and then shall we find rest unto our souls. The rest that we are promised comes after the laboring. It is Jesus who provides that rest, and that rest which is eternal, that has been prepared, and then it's in a prepared place for us, which he again mentions in John chapter 14, verse 1 to 4. It is Jesus who can be relied on for this provision, for he is faithful. And so this Labor Day, I hope that we can be reminded about God's case for labor, and that we as Christians should adopt a healthy perspective towards it. Firstly, again, that we can be reminded that God remembers our labors and our works for him. Secondly, that this labor is not just centered in this life, but should be looking towards eternity. And finally, that the labor will be rewarded with rest. So I wish you a very restful holiday and happy Labor Day, and as well as a very blessed week ahead. God bless you. Holy and holy,